Okay, today we're going to talk about texturing objects. And so in order to apply textures onto objects, you'll need to learn how to UV. So to start off, let's just UV a simple object here. So we're just going to start with a square. I'm going to turn this into more of a rectangular shape here. But to start off, just create a square or a cube, which is this button up here under poly modeling, or you can go to create polygon primitives and then cube. Either way you want. And so the first thing I want to do here is we're in the Maya Classic view and we're going to do UVing here. And so I want to go to the UVing view. So that is, if we click this workspace tab up here at the top right and then go down to UV editing. UV editing, so this should come up. It looks a little bit different than it's supposed to. Let's see if, okay, so this is good that this problem's showing up. So for some of you, for most of you, it should show up as two screens right here, like a split view. Let's see if I press split view. So my computer doesn't do it correctly. So that's okay. I'll show you how, if this doesn't show up with two screens here, which is what you want, I'll show you how to do that. So just go over here to this two panel layout button right here, press that, and then I'll go here to panels, perspective. I'll leave that up for a moment. So I'm going to change that left panel to the perspective view by going up to that top, panels, perspective, and perspective. And then here, I'm going to do the same thing. I just want the UV layout view. So let's see if I can find that here. Okay, so go to panels, panel. This is my first time having to find this in this view here. So panels, panel, UV editor is what we want. So it should look something like this for you. And so what are UVs? So basically what a UV is it's kind of related to these other modes that we've been talking about before, where we have objects mode that selects the whole object. We have vertex, which selects one vertex and you can move it in 3D space. And then you have edges and faces, where you can grab an edge or a face and move it around in 3D space. And so what a UV is the way I like to think about it, and you'll see that it's an option right there to the right in that direction beyond these other options. And what a UV is it's essentially, imagine that your model is being wrapped up in wrapping paper, and that wrapping paper is what the UV is. So it doesn't have to do with the 3D positions of things in space or anything like that. It's just the wrapping paper that's going around the object that helps us apply a texture that's not just, you know, a plain solid color, you know, like a wood grain or, you know, anything like that. That's kind of image based that we need to wrap around the image. So with this view, there's kind of, man, my view is definitely a little abnormal right now. Let's see if I can problem solve why my view is showing up like this. This is going to make it hard for me to work. So here we go. These little tabs right here, make sure that those are closed out. Do you see these little lines with the arrows through them right there? We don't need any of those. So if your menu is showing up kind of weird like mine, and I'm also on a small laptop here, which is kind of making this a little difficult, just make sure that those tabs are closed right there. Because this button right here is the main button that we need in this view. And what that button is the checkerboard. It applies a checkerboard onto the object here. And you can see here, I'm just going to close, oh right, I'm going to close the outliner so that we can see this a little bit better. So that checkerboard button applies a checkerboard onto the object and this is what you want when you're unwrapping things here, is you want the checkerboard to be completely square. And we don't want these to be stretched out or any kind of rectangle or anything like that, because that means if it's stretched out, if you apply a wood grain texture or something like that onto the model, the image will get stretched out and warped in that instance here. So let's just imagine that we're modeling a more complicated object than a cube. If you just bring up a cube and you don't change it at all, it'll come out UV'd mostly, mostly correctly here. Pretty good. So let's just say though that we have, a table or something like that that's just like a little more complicated or stretched out. You see here that I made a rectangle, but these UVs over here, they didn't adjust at all. And they got all stretched out here. So if we apply a wood grain onto this thing or something like that, it's not going to come out well. So that's just an instance of where we'll need to UV something. And so to start out with UVing can seem a little foreign at first. It gets easier the more you do it. But let's just start out with UVing a rectangle here. So UVing, the first thing I want to do here is show you in this UV mode, when you right click and hold right click, these options are a little bit different than normal. So if you right click here, you have vertex, edge, UV, and face down there. And over here, we have edge and face and vertice as well as UV. But we also have this UV shell option, which will be really helpful. So that's going to come up later. So what I like to do just to start off is in UV shell selects all the UVs at once. And I'm just going to delete these UVs. And you can see the object didn't delete. It only deleted the wrapping paper, right? So that's fine. We're going to create a new projection here. And so to UV this, we're going to need to kind of reproject to get what we need here. And so in order to make a projection, we just go down here under the UV toolkit on the right, and then keep in mind we're in the UV editing workspace. So that's why I have this UV toolkit here. And having this UV toolkit is going to be really helpful here, because every control that we're going to need is right in here, and pretty easy to find. So we're going to create projections here. So this create tab right here is only projections. And so what we're going to need to do here is we're going to need to create planar projections to kind of create this model here. One thing that I want to show you before we get started on that though is we have these different projection modes. So we have automatic and cylindrical and spherical. So if you have a cylinder, starting out with a cylindrical projection can be a good place to start. And same if you have a spherical object. Both of those can get a little wonky though. And then this automatic button kind of does all the work for us here. And so I'm going to do the automatic button just to show you what that does. Sorry, I need to have the object selected in objects mode, and then try the automatic map. And you'll see here that it automatically projected UVs onto the scene here. Let's see here. I just want to see. Yeah, it's funny because usually the automatic projection comes out a little bit better than that. This came out a bit stretched. There might need to be a setting change here. I'm not going to dive into that too far because automatic mapping is not what we're going to end up doing here today. But automatic mapping is a little bit of a get out of jail free card, except for you'll see it projected it so these are still stretched out right here, which is not great. So, but one thing that it does do here is you can see here it lays out each panel of the piece of paper, and it separated each side out into its own face, which is not great. And then, but it does lay it out from this 0 to 1 to 0 to 1 box here, which is good. So basically when you UV, we're going to unwrap the wrapping paper and kind of put it back into this 0 to 1, 0 to 1 box right there. If these boxes aren't showing up for you, just make sure that this button is selected right here. It's the grid display button. So I just turned it off. And so right where my cursor is, that'll kind of bring it back up again. And so we need all these UVs to show up in the 0 to 1, 0 to 1. And then we're going to export a snapshot of this into Photoshop, and then we're going to apply our texture onto it and bring it back. But if any of these UVs are sitting outside of this box like this, it's going to cause errors in the final export here. So this is a preview of what we want things to eventually look like here. But we're going to do this the right way here. So I'm going to delete these, and we're going to do planar projections of each side of this object here. And so the planar projection, I'm going to select the top and the bottom face here to start out. And I'm going to do a planar projection from the top here to get started. So next to on planar projections, there should be an option box next to it, but for some reason Maya didn't do that. So, but we need the options here. So if you just hold down Shift and you press planar, the options box will show up. And what we need here is you need to make sure that this is checked off. Keep image width height ratio should be checked. If that's not checked, it'll come in squished. And we can project the UVs from the camera view, so you could just set up the camera to be exactly where you want. But since this is a square that we know is going perfectly along the X, Y, and Z axis, we should definitely project from the axes here. So if you look where my cursor is right here, you see a Y, an X, and a Z right there. And so that kind of helps you preview, especially if you toggle your model around, which axis you want to project from up here. So we can see here that the Y is the vertical axis. So if we want to do a vertical shot of the top and the bottom, that's what we want. And then when we want later, when we want to do these smaller sides, like that face right there, we're going to want Z. And for these longer sides, we're going to want X. And so I'm going to make sure that the top face and the bottom face are both selected here. And then I'm going to project from the Y axis. And press Apply. And then close. And you'll see here, you should have a perfect grid on both the top and the bottom here. And so I'm just going to drag these out of the way. And right now they're overlapping each other in the UV mode, which is not helpful. So what you need to do here, and this is a little bit tricky, and again, I'm kind of zooming in out of this UV view the same way we do with the orthographic view. I'm pressing Option, and I'm pressing the middle mouse button, holding down the middle mouse button to bring it this way. And then while holding Option, I'm also doing a right click and dragging left to right to zoom in. Also, the F button works to frame things up. So I need to separate these two pieces of paper because they're overlapping right now. So I'm just going to select off of it. Then I'm going to right click and go to UV shell right here. And this might not work the first time. You might need to just click through this a few times. It's a little buggy. So I'm just going to, with UV shell as the mode, I'm just going to click right here with the plain click, press W. And then I'm just going to drag from the center right there. And if that doesn't work for you right at first, just kind of try it a few times and try just kind of clicking on it a little bit differently and pressing W. If you do it exactly the way I did it there, it should just kind of work. And so anyway, with the model, we have a perfect projection from the top and we have a perfect projection from the bottom. So now we need to just do two more projections, one from the Z and one from the X. So I'm going to right click, go to face in the perspective mode. So again, I'm in the perspective view and just right clicking and going to face mode. I'm going to hold down, I'm going to select that face right there, then hold down Shift, select that face right there. And now I'm going to project from the Z axis, because that's the way those are lining up, kind of using this little viewport right there. So I'm going to, with both of those faces selected, under the UV toolkit, under Create, same step as before, just one more change, one different change here. So I'm going to hold Shift and press Planar to get the options box. And now I'm just going to project from the Z axis this time. press apply, and then close this out. And just drag these pieces of paper out of the way there. Press Q to get out of it. And you can see here, looking in the perspective view, that side looks perfect, that side looks perfect. So we're almost there. So same step as before. I just want to separate these into two sheets of paper here. So I'll right click, go to UV shell, just click right on it normally and press W and drag away. And again, if they're not separating, just be patient with it and just kind of keep working on it. It should separate as long as you projected both faces, you know, so as long as you selected a face and then press, and held down Shift and projected both of those faces at the same time, those two pieces of paper should separate there. And so last one is I'm going to select this face right here, this face right there, and then I'm going to project from, it looks like the x-axis. So over here in the UV toolkit, same thing as before, hold down Shift, click on planar, and then we're going to do the x-axis this time. Press apply, and then close. And so now we have a projection of those two. So press Q to get out of it. Right click UV shell right here. So right click UV shell, select it, press W. One thing too that might be causing problems for some people is I'm not doing a drag select. So if you do a drag select, it will select both of those. Instead, I'm just clicking on it and then pulling it off. So yeah, don't do a drag select there, just click right on it there. Okay, so now we have projections. So everything's laid out now. And so the next thing we need to do is we need to make this so it's easy to work on in Photoshop. We need to scale all these so that they're the same size as one another. And then we need to finally make them all fit into this 0 to 1 box there and export into Photoshop. So if you look at this right here, this checkerboard up here is much larger than those checkerboards. And so what that means is if we had a texture or we painted on it, and let's just say we had a paintbrush and it went from there to there, the paintbrush would go from really big to really small right there because those aren't even. And so this is actually pretty easy to fix. So I'm just going to select this face right here. I'm going to bring it down to here. And I can see here that I need to make this a lot smaller to fit into that 0 to 1 box here. So I'm just going to press R on my keyboard and scale it down. And I think this is about the scale I want everything else to be. So with that face selected, I'm going to go over here to the UV toolkit and we're going to make all these the same scale as one another. And so under transform, we're going to go under transform tab here, open that up. And then we're going to go down to the very bottom of transform, and you should find this texel density pixel per unit thing right here, and it should say get a number and then a set. So what we're going to do here, so texel density refers to, it's a fancy word for how big are the UVs for what you have selected here. So I want to kind of get the texel density or the UV size of the square, and then I want to set it, that size, to the rest of these. So I'm going to select this face and I'm going to press get, and then this number to the right of it should change. So it changed to 18.9. And now I'm just going to drag and select, so just a normal drag and select, so I select all these others. And then I'm going to press set, and then they're going to jump to become that same size as that one right there. So now all these are the same size. So we're most of the way there now. So the next thing we want to do is these are all in separate, these are all different pieces of paper here. And so we're going to lay this out flat and then we're going to paint on it in Photoshop. But to make our lives easier in Photoshop, it's going to be a lot easier to work with if we combine some of these, if we stitch them together. So that's what we're going to do, is we're going to position them and then stitch them together here. So I closed out of that transform tab. And now we're kind of looking into the cut and sew tab right here under the UV toolkit. But first I need to position the pieces of paper so that they line up pretty well. So I'm going to select this face right here. So this face right here is the top. And I'm going to select this one right here. And then I'm going to just right click and get an edge. And you see here, if I select that edge, this edge up here is the same as that edge right there. So I just want to line them up so that they're in a similar place here. And actually using the transform tool, I'm going to close out the cut and sew here, but we are going to go to the cut and sew in just a moment here. Before that, I'm going to use the transform tab just a little bit more, and then I'm going to scroll down to around where the textile density is here. But if you look up here, we have this rotate button, which will be really helpful. So I just need to rotate this face 90 degrees so that it matches up. So right there, and then I think I need to do it clockwise, and I'll press W. And what I'm doing here is it doesn't need to be right on top of it, but just get it close. And you don't want it overlapping like that. So it's better just to give it like a little bit of distance. And again, it doesn't need to be perfect, just lining it up. And so now if I right click and go to edge, and I select this edge right there, you see both of those lines are selected. So that's good. And if you see here, this is a really helpful thing, is remember in the UV toolkit, we can right click and we select faces and edges here. So I can select a face over here in the UV toolkit, and then I'll select that same edge in the perspective view. And that becomes really helpful here down the road here. So especially on more complicated UVs. So we're just going to do that same step that I just did for all these other sides. I kind of want this top to be like if we unfolded the pieces of paper, and then this bottom is just going to be its own kind of section on its own. So right click, edge, and I'm going to select that edge, so the other long top edge, and I see that this edge is that edge. So this time I need to rotate it counterclockwise. So I'm going to go right click face, select that face right there, and if this was a more complicated model where there's a bunch of faces on there, I would just do UV shell, because it selects everything on that slice of paper on its own right there. So UV shell, I'll kind of continue to demonstrate UV shell more, but when these pieces of paper get combined, it'll kind of UV shell select anything that's combined together. So anyway, I digress there. So this edge is that edge, so I need to do counterclockwise on this one. Press W, and just position it a little bit. Oops. That's good enough. And same thing for the small ones here. So I'm just going to move these closer in. And I'm going to right click and go to edge here. So I can see this needs a whole 180. So before I proceed further though, there's one step that's really important here that I nearly forgot about, which is I projected, let's just remember, for instance, I projected from the top and it did both the top and the bottom. And so the bottom is going to be inside out. And so how do you tell if this is inside out? So this is the other really important button. So the most important button here is this checkerboard box. And then the second most important button here is this box right here. And it's called shaded UV shells with semi-transparency is kind of what it's called there. And what it's going to do is it's going to turn your model blue and red here. So I just clicked on it there, and we can see the model's now blue and red. I'm going to turn off the checkerboards just for a second so we can see. And so we can actually see here, blue is good and red is inside out. And so how do you fix this? Really, really easy. We just go to face here. We find that face, which is inside out. And right here, so we did the textile density under transform. So this is all under the Transform tab in the UV Toolkit. We did Texel Density before. We've been doing the Rotate button right here. But then underneath Scale, there's this Flip button right here. And so this Flip button is what we need, and it'll turn it correct here. So I'll just flip both of those, and again, do it up here. So now everything's blue and it's good. I'll probably need to reposition some of these, most likely, so that the edge lines up again, because I've kind of flipped it inside out. But I'm just going to press W, move that into position. And now I need to just double check my work here. So you see here that this was lining up correctly before, but I forgot that this was inside out. So that edge is now that edge. So we just need to line these up so we can stitch them together. So I'm going to select this face right here, and I'm just going to rotate it twice so that it does a 180. And now if I do edge, you see that this kind of highlighted green, that's the same edge right there. So that's good. This edge is good. And so now for this one, you can see here that I need this edge to line up with that one. So this up here, I need to flip it 180 degrees. So I'll just press that twice, or rotate it twice. Doesn't matter if it's clockwise or counterclockwise here. Now when I right click and go to edge, they're lining up. So now I'm just going to reposition this so that it's in position. And finally, one of these actually lines up. So for this last one, you can see that top edge is the same as that edge right there. So all we need to do for this one is just position it down, and we're just getting it right into place. So the steps that we're doing there, just to kind of, just to recap what we've done so far, is we created projections for each face here. And one thing, one note I'd like to give here is that for a more complicated model, you don't need to project for each face here. It's, you'll be able to kind of, with a much more complicated model, and we'll find this as the course progresses here, you'll be able to UV it with pretty much the same amount of steps as we're doing here for this simple object. So don't worry, you're not going to need to project for every single face on, if you're making a gear, for instance. There's this kind of gets simpler. So anyway, we projected from each side, and then we use the Texel density right here to scale them so that they're all proportional to one another, which is really important to kind of get them in proportion with each other. And then I clicked this button right here to turn it blue and red, and we want to make sure to get rid of any red in there. And so to get rid of any red faces, we just use this flip button right here, which is right above the Texel density. And then from there, I wanted this top section to be kind of like wrapping paper that got unwrapped from the top here. And so I need to have these kind of connected with each other, which is going to be the next step. But before doing that, I just rotated them so that the edges line up. So those edges line up, those line up, those line up, and those line up. So we're now ready to move on to the next step. So that was so far we've only used the create to create the projections and the transform tab to get to where we are now. And now we're going to go down to cut and sew. And so for cut and sew, this is going to be pretty simple, is these things are already cut apart, and so we're sewing them together now. So I'm just going to right click and go to edge in the UV toolkit. I'm going to select those edges, and then I'm just going to press under cut and sew, I'm going to press sew. And do that for each edge here. And so now this is all one shell. So if I go to UV shell now, it selects that whole group at once. And so that's kind of a better example of the way the UV shell works and how the UV shell becomes way more helpful on the more complicated models, or once you've kind of gotten a ways in sewing this together. So anyway, sewing is done. So That's all we needed to do for the sew. So now, directly under cut and sew, we're going to go to unfold. So now we just need to make sure to kind of use unfold to kind of get things as straight as possible. You can see during the sewing process things got warped just a little bit. And so for this model, we're going to actually do straighten here. So I'm going to select the UV shell, and I'm going to do straighten UVs. But before doing that, I just want to take a second to talk about this. Depending on the model that you're UVing, let's see if I can get this stupid thing to go away. You might want to do unfold or optimize, particularly for more complicated models. A lot of time, most of the time, that's what you want. Since we're UVing something incredibly simple where we know all these are perfectly straight lines here, straighten UVs is actually going to be what's helpful here. So just kind of keep that in mind. We're going to do straighten UVs here. Down the road, just always check to see if optimize or unfold works. It just depends on the model which one of those 3 buttons works best. For this one, straighten UVs is going to work. And so if you see when I clicked it, it just got all these lines perfectly straight. So I'm going to edit undo. So that was before. Now straighten UVs, and it just kind of popped them into place there. So from here, we're basically done with UVing. So we just need to kind of put these into the 0 to 1 to 0 to 1 space. And just keep in mind that we don't want them, any pixels even, or any UVs even just going even 1 pixel outside of that box. We need them to definitely be all the way in there. And so now, with all of them selected, I just want to scale these up a little bit because any negative space in here is wasted resolution, because we're going to attach a Photoshop file to Maya to kind of get that texture transferred, and any blank space in here is just kind of just lost resolution. The computer's still going to have to compute it, but there just won't be any pixel or any image information there. So to scale them up as much as you can while leaving a clear amount of space at the edges here, so we can clearly see that this is not getting out of that 0 to 1 area. And we're going to review here, and this is ready to go. So as long as your model looks blue from every direction when this button is selected, and then if you have this checkerboard button selected, all these checkerboards look correct, you know, or look square instead of rectangular, then you're good to go. So these are pretty much perfect UVs that we have here. So I'm just going to save this real quick. This is a big long demo I was doing for another class. I'm just going to go ahead and save this as UV1, just so in case things crash here. And so what we're going to do now is we're going to take a snapshot of this and bring it into Photoshop. So we are going to, in order to do that, in the UV view, just go to Image, and then UV Snapshot. So I'm just going to leave that up for a second. So in the UV Editor view at the top, or towards the top of that view, go to Image, and then towards the bottom, UV Snapshot, ... So we'll do that. This menu will come up, and I'm going to save this into my source images of the project that I'm currently using here. So normally I would save it into source images. This project's pretty complicated, so I'm just going to save it into images here just to keep things a little simple. For you, though, save it into source images. And I'm just going to call this UV1, save. And I kind of want this file format to be a TIFF. I think that'll work out better for all of you rather than a JPEG, because we'll just have an alpha channel in there, which will be very helpful here. The size, 2048 by 2048, is good. With textures, you're always going to want it's always going to need to be square. It's always going to need to be one of a few options here. 2048 by 2048 is the safest option, especially for this class. That's going to be what you're using most of the time. But the other file sizes, and we're going to go over this in later classes, are going to be 4096 by 4096 or 1024 by 1024. if you want to go smaller. And so, but for this, default is good. So I'm going to just press apply. And it might, the objects might need to be selected in objects mode for this to work. Let's try that again. Okay, so make sure that your object is selected in objects mode. So right click and do object. I had this selected by UV shell, which was a mistake before, and so a little red error message showed up down here. So just make sure this is selected in objects mode and press apply. And that should export it here. So if I open up Photoshop, oh whoops, that's the demo I was doing for the other class. I'm going to open up the UVs. So file open, and then go to wherever you saved yours. I'm going to open it up. And so here, these checkerboards in Photoshop mean that that's an alpha channel. So a checkerboard kind of means a different thing from altogether and from Maya to Photoshop here. So the checkerboard just means that the layer we have here is transparent. I'm just going to call this UV. And so what we're going to do here is we're going to apply a texture to this. And so here, if you go to the D2L, there's a texture that I have that we can use that is loaded. So if you go under your D2L for this class and you go under content and we look under video lessons, the HDRI map library, and then under texture files, we have this wood texture here. So I just kind of provided this wood texture for this particular example here. So just download that, and we're going to use that texture here. And I'm just going to right click and open this in Photoshop. So we have that wood texture there. And so this is our UVs. And so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a new layer, and I'm just going to use the paint bucket tool with white selected down here. So double click here, go to white, and just paint bucket tool it to fill it up. And I'm going to drag it below the UV. So now we can kind of see the UVs a little better right here. It's a little hard to see in my screen, but the further you zoom in, the clearer they show up. So what I'm going to do here is with the UVs selected, I'm going to lock it, and that's just going to help later to make sure that we don't drag this around by mistake when we're moving things around. So I'm just going to lock that UV layer, and I created a white background before just so I could see the UVs a little bit better here. And now I'm going to go over to the wood texture, and I'm going to right click, and I'm going to duplicate that layer. So again, I just went to the layer down here, right click, and then go to duplicate layer. And then under document, I want it to be under that UV document that we're working on here. And so here, what we're going to do is transform the wood texture to fit inside the UVs. And so we're going to use the free transform tool. And so the way that I just scaled that down is I pressed on a Mac Command T as free transform. And then if that shortcut's not working for any reason, if you go to edit and then free transform right here, that's what I'm using. So free transform, and then if you just drag the corner, it'll scale it in proportion. If you do not want it to be in proportion, you are going to want this to be in proportion, but if you, for any other time you don't, you just hold down Shift and then you can scale it to be any proportion you want. I'm going to edit undo that. And so I'm just using the free transform tool to scale it so that it kind of fits over those UVs a little bit. But you can see we need more of this here. So I'm going to duplicate this wood. I'm going to name it just so it becomes less complicated. So I'm going to duplicate this. You can right click and go to duplicate layer, or you can press Command J. So Command J on your keyboard will duplicate it. But if you don't want to do Command J, just go duplicate layer. We're not dragging it to a different document this time, so just press OK. And I'll press V on my keyboard, or just plain move tool. And I'll hold down Shift. So if you hold down Shift, it'll drag it straight down. I cannot drag it left or right, which is good. You know, I just want this to go straight down in this instance and get it to that position. And so you see here, we have this giant seam going along across there. And so one good way to get rid of that seam is just to flip this 180 degrees, this bottom piece right here. So with that bottom piece selected in the layer view, I'm going to go to Edit, not Image, but Edit, Transform, and then Flip Vertical. So Edit, Transform, Flip Vertical. And you can see here that that mostly fixed things. So now what I show you is the clone brush tool, which is going to be super helpful for texturing in Maya, and it's going to be used a lot. So in order to use the clone brush tool, we need to combine these two layers. So I'm just going to hold down Shift, select both of these layers, right click, and go to Merge Layers. So they're now all one layer there. And I'm going to zoom in a little bit. And I'm using the navigator view to zoom in, and you can get this navigator view where you can kind of zoom in by pressing the small mountains. You can zoom out, big mountains you zoom in, and then you can grab this box and move it to wherever in the image you want it to go. If you want that menu, it's under Window and Navigator right there. Otherwise, you can just press Z on your keyboard to zoom in and out, and that'll do the same thing here. And if you press spacebar, it'll give you the shortcut, this hand that lets you move your image around. So I kind of use, I use a combination of the Z button, the spacebar to kind of move it around, and then sometimes I'll just use the navigator view if I've kind of lost my place a little bit. So the clone stamp tool is this button right here. And one thing that's really helpful about Adobe is they have these little learn more buttons. So if you ever become forgetful on any of these tools at any point, or just want to kind of continue to learn, those can be really helpful. And so if you look at this example up here, he's taking a target right there, and then he's painting that target into that blank space to kind of clone certain areas. So we're going to do that same thing here. So press the clone button, and then if you hold down Option, so Option on your keyboard, it'll give you this little target thing here. And keep your eye on this seam right here. We're just trying to paint out that seam that's going right along there. So I'm going to press the target button, and I'm just going to click right on one of these lines here. And you see it clones it down to here. And you might want to get a smaller paintbrush than what I'm using right here. So to do that, you just you can either go up to usually it's up there. I always do the shortcuts where I just right click and change the size down here with the slider. So that's looking good. Click out of it. And so I'm just going to use the clone stamp to just paint out the seam. That's a little bright. Let's see if I can get this a little better. There we go, that looks a little better. And so you can see here, it does a pretty good job just cloning things out. And if you do it right, you can get almost all of this just with one clean sweep here. Oops, I lost my place. Oh, there it is. Which is a good sign. If you lose your place, that means things are looking good here. So there we go. I combined those two images into one, and then use the clone stamp tool to fix things up. So I kind of like this proportion here, so I'm just going to duplicate this again. So press Command J or right click and duplicate layer and press OK to create a duplicate there. And then I'm just going to hold down Shift, press V to get the transform tool, or press this button right here, and then hold down Shift and drag it the way I'm doing here. And that looks okay. And I'm going to Shift click both of these wood layers, and then I'm going to merge them again and just do the same step again, where we just clone it and fix some of these seams. So S is the shortcut for the clone stamp tool, or you can just press the clone stamp tool right there. Option is the button that you want to memorize for the clone stamp, where it kind of gets your target area. Try to line it up perfectly. And we'll just kind of clone out. Oops, got a little messy there. So I got away with one brush there, but I'm just going to need to be patient here. And I created a new clone area for the right side from the left. Just kind of getting rid of that seam right there. So this area gets a little bit dark there. One way to fix that, there's a lot of ways, is we can use the dodge tool, and it kind of adds like a little added exposure into the area. So if I just do that, I can kind of paint back out some of the darkness of that seam. And we can also just kind of continue to kind of clone stamp. To get this looking the way we want. And then opposite of that, we have the burn tool, which darkens the exposure here. And you can kind of lessen the severity here. Normally, if I was doing this, I'd be using my my stylus, but I'm using a mouse right now, so it's a little clunky. But anyway, we have that there. And so we have the top and the sides are all on the left there, and this should look okay. And now I'm just going to duplicate this whole thing and just put it on the bottom here. So I press Command J, or you can right click and go to duplicate. I got my duplicate here. I press V on my keyboard, or this button up here. And I'm just going to hold down Shift and drag it over that other area. And so now I'm just going to go File, Save As, and where are we? Okay, we're under, yeah, so save it under Source Images, and I'm just going to call this wood texture V1. Save it as a PSD. You can also save it as any format you want, but I like saving it as a PSD here because I'm probably going to want to go back and make some small adjustments here. So back in the Maya view, we're going to exit the UV editing mode. Oops, because we're kind of done with UV editing here. And so I'm just back to the Maya Classic view, and we've got our rectangle right there. And so we're going to go to the hypershade so that we can apply this texture onto this object. So I'm going to click on the hypershade button, which is that little circular button right there where my cursor is. We're going to get this menu. And if you recall, this section right here is where we kind of add our new shaders to the scene. This section here is the existing shaders within the scene. This is a preview of the material that we have selected. And then this is the property editor, which is like the attribute editor of the of the shader we have. So we're going to create a new shader. So I'm going to go under Arnold and press on Shader, and then scroll down to where it says AI Standard Surface. So again, Arnold Shader, AI Standard Surface, which is the light gray one with the A above the icon right there. So I'm just going to click on that, and the nodes will show up here, as well as the little icon over there. And you can navigate this view, the node view, the same way we do with the orthographic view or the UV editor view, is you hold down Option and then use your middle mouse button to move around like this, and continue to hold down Option. If you drag left to right on your right mouse button, it'll zoom in and out. You can also press F to frame up on things. to whatever you have selected there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just start off by renaming this. So I'm going to go up here, click on that new AI standard surface that we made, right click, go to this bottom menu right here, and just rename it. We could also rename it over in this section. So I'm going to rename, I'll just call this Wood 1. And so now we're going to take that texture that we made in Photoshop and apply it to the base color here. So with this node selected, the main node for the material, before we apply the texture though, I need to assign this to the material, or this material to the object. So to assign this material to the object, we just select the object, go over here, right click, assign material to selection. And it should get a little darker there. It should kind of pop up a little darker there. So now that AI standard surface shader is on the object. So now let's apply the texture to the shader. So to apply that Photoshop texture that we just made to the color of the shader, oops, we're just going to select this node right here. Towards the top here, second from the top on color, we can change the color of the material right here, and we can use the slider. But what we want to do is we want to attach a file. So press this checkerboard box here, and these checkerboard boxes all mean do you want attach a file to that parameter. So we're going to press that checkerboard box. This will come up, and we'll press File, which should be fourth from the top here. So File right there. And press F. Oops. Need to select all these. Press F just so that they frame up. So it went from just these two nodes to having 4 nodes right here. And so all this changed is this node right here is the file that we've yet to attach. And so I'm just going to select this node right here. And then it should on the right here under the properties editor have image name in a folder right there. So just click on the folder, and I'll need to, again, save it in source images. I saved it into images here just to because I was already working in a more complicated scene here, so it was getting a little messy. So anyway, attach your wood texture file that we just made in Photoshop here, and it should just, if you see how it plugs on, the out color goes to the base color here. And so now if we render this in the Arnold render view, it should show up as having wood on it, although I've not added lights to the scene yet, so it's going to just show up as black right now if I were to render it. So let's just quickly add a light into this scene. And so for quick lighting, something I like to do is just go to Arnold, Lights, the bottom physical sky right there. And so that just creates, it's like the sky dome light that we've used before to create detailed HDRI maps, but the physical sky is just kind of like a default sky that can have its advantages for certain situations, but it's just kind of like a simpler default version of the sky dome light. And for final renders, I don't really recommend the physical sky, except for some very specific circumstances. But anyway, I just like to use that for this here to kind of see, get an even lighting on the scene and see if the wood texture is working. So I just went to Arnold, Lights, Physical Sky to do that. So now if we render it, it should show up. So I'm just going to press Arnold, open Arnold render view, and press this play button, the red play button here. I'll need to think for a second. And so here we can see that the wood texture has been applied to the object. So one thing I'm going to do here is I'm just going to go in the Arnold render view. I'm going to go to Window, 3D Manipulation. And so from here, when you press that 3D manipulation button, it just makes it so that you can kind of navigate using that view. So you can see here that the wood texture applied pretty well onto the model. And sorry, I just needed to take a little bit of a closer look on this at this thing. So you can see here that we have the seam right here, which isn't kind of the way this would behave if this was a table, because either that seam would go all the way through right there or it just wouldn't exist. So I'm going to paint out that seam in Photoshop and update it. I'm going to do the same here. And so we're just going to make those adjustments in Photoshop and then reload the shader into Maya here. I'm just going to turn off 3D manipulation there. So I'm going to open up Photoshop and, oh, whoops. The UVs are meant to be above it here. That was a mess up on my part. So you can see the UVs here. And so having the UVs above the texture, that's kind of the reason I made that mistake in the first place, is you can see here that seam is going through that side, and we don't want that. And so what I'm going to do here, so I'm going to see here. Okay, so this is the bottom wood, and then this is the top. Okay, so with the top wood selected, I'm going to use the clone stamp again to paint out that seam. So press clone stamp here, press option to find some wood grain that you want. I'm going to try from over here. And it's not showing up. Why is that happening? Okay, I'm not sure why that wasn't working before, but I turned off my UV guidelines there, and then I merged my two wood layers there. So this seam right here is what I'm getting rid of. So I'm going to clone stamp, and so you see here, I kind of got a little greedy here and dragged from too close. Sometimes that can be a problem. I know that this section right here is not being used by any UV, so it's kind of okay, because this isn't showing up on the model anywhere. So the fact that it's repeating is actually fine. Okay, yeah, that's fine. This was a problem on the other side as well. So I'm just going to paint out this seam right here now. Okay. So I'm going to, before exporting it here, I'm going to turn off this UV layer, because if I kept that UV on, it would just, these white lines would show up on the model. So we just want to turn that off so the white lines don't show up superimposed on the model there. And then just go to File, Save. I'm not going to save as any, a new thing or anything like that. So just File, Save. And so if we render now, it won't have updated. So we just need to go to the Hypershade view, select on this. So this is our wood texture right here. We've got that file node, which is this node right here. So select this node. And then right here, just press reload. So if you press reload there, I like to press it twice just to make sure. It should hopefully update here. So I need to think about it. And so now when we look at it, it's going to just need a second to update. We can see here that that seam is gone. So that's kind of how you make that update to the model and kind of get rid of seams. And this is kind of the main way, or the most traditional way, to texture objects in Maya. And it gets simpler and simpler as you get used to it here, and I'll show kind of other demonstrations with kind of more complicated models, and this is going to all become easier and easier here. So this is one of several ways that we can texture an object in Maya. There's a couple other ways I'll show you over this course here. So we can use Mudbox, and so in that process, you UV the object the exact same way as we did before, and then you paint directly on the model in 3D space, and that's typically my favorite way to texture things. A lot of times I will use this Photoshop technique, particularly if, for instance, you're creating a floor or anything geometric, and Photoshop ends up kind of being the best option for texturing. And then there's just a few other ways and tricks that I'll show over the period of the course, but this is kind of the most important way to learn, and this is how you apply textures onto your objects.